Hello and welcome everyone to the second IJMS webinar on observational study designs and reporting guidelines. So for our speakers for today, Dr. Thomas Amuti and Francisco J. Barrera Flores will be introducing the speakers first and then we'll go to the actual webinar. Dr. Thomas Amuti is a doctor working currently at the Consolata Hospital in Meru County, and he's also a member of the anatomy tutors at Nairobi University, Department of Human Anatomy. He's a researcher at RESPEKT, which is a sensitizing high school students on reproductive and sexual health and rights. Chair in the charity group dubbed Angel Arms of Hope, chair of researcher group for undergraduate dubbed RE-Med, Research in Medicine of University of Nairobi, and he is a journal editor at Journal of Gynecology in East and Central Africa and reviewer for Anatomical Journal of Africa. He is also a journal member of the East and Central Africa Journal of Surgery and Annals of African Surgery. He has certifications in data analysis with Python, ethics in research and systematic review writing. His basic research activity explores clinical anatomy in all its aspects, which include gross, histologic, developmental, experimental, and neurologic, as well as other clinical research areas. Dr. Thomas Amuti will talk about the observational study designs and he will introduce you about the topic of observational study designs, followed by Dr. Francisco J. Barrera Flores, who was born and raised in Monterrey, Mexico, and he studied medicine at the Universidad Autonoma de Nuevo Leon and received a Master of Science degree in epidemiology from Harvard's T.H. Chan School of Public Health. Currently, he is a postdoctoral researcher at the Harvard School of Public Health in the Department of Epidemiology and at the Massachusetts General Hospital in the Department of Psychiatry. So we welcome the speakers and over to Dr. Thomas Amuti.
So hi, thank you so much for introducing me. As already mentioned, my name is Dr. Thomas, Kenyan working in Meru at a hospital called Consolata. So I'll be taking you guys through the first part of the study designs series, in which case I'll be taking you guys through descriptive observational study designs. So as the title already suggests, we'll be dealing with study designs. The sampling part will be covered later. And as already mentioned, those are my qualifications, MBCHB, Bachelor of Science in Human Anatomy, and VETM, meaning very excited to meet you guys. So we'll just start over. So the things we're going to cover today will be as indicated in the 5 points. So the first thing will be really understanding the conceptual framework in classifying designs. Then we're going to look at the hierarchy of designs. Then we're going to look at the 3 other points that have been highlighted. So starting off with conceptual framework. So the main idea here is to really break down how the designs in research are actually classified. And as you can see, the major classification groups are either descriptive or analytical. Descriptive studies being most of the time you're just describing what you're seeing, and analytical studies meaning you have a cause and effect and which you're trying to analyze. So if you go into the descriptive studies furthermore, you can appreciate that we have case reports, case series, which we're going to discuss today, ecological studies and surveys. We're going to touch a bit on surveys. Ecological studies, I think, will be covered later. In analytical studies, you have the observational and the experimental. The difference majorly being in experimental studies, you introducing something within the study that you're doing, in which case you're putting in an intervention. I think the title is going to be an intervention. So you're having an intervention that you're introducing in your study. And the different types has highlighted for both observational and experimental. Now, coming in to understand what we term as hierarchy of study designs. Now, the first thing you need to appreciate in research is that the type of design that you carry out in your research will really determine how much your results are going to be appreciated within the scientific community. So as you can see, the hierarchy starts from the base as you're going to the top, where you have the ideas, opinions, and the editorials. Now, the main basis behind this whole hierarchy type of study design is that the more your study is replicable in a different setting, the more your results can be gotten from maybe a study that's done by replicating your methodology in a different setting, then the more your study will have what we quote unquote call power, but not really power from a statistical point, but power in the sense that your results are going to be better appreciated. So as you can see, we have the ideas, opinions, and editorials. Then you have the case series and the cross-sectional studies. So for me specifically, I'm going to be tackling the cross-sectional studies and the case series, and then my colleague is going to be tackling the rest after the presentation. So just to start off by talking about descriptive studies. So more or less, when you talk about descriptive studies, you're talking about studies which, as I've already mentioned, you're just looking at a particular outcome in a population within a particular time point. In some cases, you can actually be able to compare one group and another in these descriptive studies. And remember, the main purpose is just to, it's kind of like a snapshot. You're looking at this particular population that you want to study, and you're looking at that outcome in that particular time point. Case in point mean that you're not following any of your study or any of your sample population, either through time or trying to follow them back in time. You're just looking at an outcome that they have at that particular point. So in most of the descriptive studies, we usually don't have a really comparator group, and most of the estimates that we have is usually in terms of prevalence and incidence. Just another point is that when you look at descriptive studies, they usually describe one or more variables without regard to any cause or hypothesis. In this case, just reiterating what I talked about earlier, whereby you're just looking at outcomes of a particular population at that particular time point, and you don't have any hypothesis that you're testing. So most of the descriptive studies, as we already mentioned earlier, include case reports, which you're going to look at and give examples. We also have case series, which are just multiple case reports dealing with the same thing that you want to pass on to the scientific community. We also have surveys and cross-sectional studies. So most of the references that I'm going to put at the bottom of each slide are just papers in which all of you can go into and search. They are the papers in which I derived most of my topic on. So looking at cross-sectional studies. So a cross-sectional study involves the collection of information, or let me just put it this way, when you're just collecting a variable or multiple variables of a particular population at that time point. Meaning, for example, as we're going to look at later, if you're collecting information concerning the calcaneus, then you're looking at the length or the variables of the calcaneus of that population at that time. So regardless of whether your study time exceeds 1 day, which is very important to mention, as long as you're collecting the same data within a particular time point, that is still classified as a cross-sectional study. Now, the main advantages of this type of study, of course, is that it's actually cheap and simple, and it's ethically safe, because most of them really don't involve in any interventions that will be ethically unsafe. Then, of course, the disadvantages are as mentioned. So we're going to discuss two papers, both of which I participated as an author. So the first one being the morphometric dimensions of the calcaneus. So in this study, our main aim was to just look at as many calcanea as we will find based on our sample population that we calculated. And from these particular groups of calcaneus that we will get, we wanted to look at the length, the width, and some of the other parameters that you can see from the calcaneus that is on the left of the study. So in this particular study, our main aim was to just see what are the dimensions of the calcaneus in our population, especially appreciating from the fact that these dimensions have actually been described as different from different populations. So we wanted to see the dimensions in our setting. And further on, we wanted to be able to see what particular equations we can come up with that can predict the dimensions of the calcaneus in our population, given that most patients who you're going to manage with calcaneal injuries might have bilateral fractures of the calcaneus. So you can see in this study, what we basically did, just reiterating a cross-sectional study, is that we just aimed to go to a population, and from this population, we just looked at the length of the calcaneus. We didn't follow anyone to determine how their lengths are going to be with time or how it was before. We just looked at those particular dimensions at that particular time. Another study that I would like to mention is a study that we did on the sex determination from dimensions of the distal tibia in an adult Kenyan population. Just to reiterate, as you can see from the images, what we basically did was from the fibula incisura, we actually took the length, the width, and the height. From the middle malleolus, we took the height and the width. And for the tibial plafond, we actually took the length and the width and the height as well. And from these parameters, we were able to determine, first, are there differences between the male and the female population? And second, will you be able to get an equation which could be able to predict for us the accuracy of determining the gender based on these particular parameters? So just to reiterate the same, you can see that you're collecting data at a particular time point. You're not following the dimensions of this patient through time. We're not trying to look at them back in time as to how they were. You're actually collecting data as is at that particular point. So just for those who will be interested, from this particular study, we came to realize that by using the tibia of our population, being the Kenyan population, we could be able to predict the gender of our setting by 75%, which was actually higher as compared to a previous study that has been done by Cohort 2005 by looking at the femur and its use in predicting gender. So you're actually able to come up with the conclusion that if you use the tibia and these parameters that we had, 75% of the times you can actually be able to predict the gender, which is the highest particular predictive value we have currently in our setting based on the bones, the forensics. Now, going on to case studies and series, as I've already mentioned, case studies are this type of studies whereby you want to capture something. It's like you are a photographer, yeah? And you have this particular one-time image that you got that really fascinated you, and you want to make sure that you have it. So case studies are just the same. So most of the time, they tend to happen as you're collecting your data for particular research. And what tends to happen is that you'll have this particular one case for yours that you're going to realize that it's actually different from the rest, and it actually have scientific impact. So in our case, for example, if by the example that you're going to give, you're going to see that, for example, for us, as you're collecting the calcaneal study, you're able to come across one particular calcaneus that actually had a difference from the rest, and you're going to discuss that. Now, that notwithstanding, case studies are not limited to cases anatomically solely. In this case, you can also have cases, for example, within your wards, in your areas of study, as we're going to discuss one on lymphedema in our case. So it's not limited particularly to anatomical studies. It can also be in the clinical studies whereby you have this rare observation that you made and you want to communicate it most of the time because it has a scientific impact. Case series, on the other hand, as already mentioned, is just an aggregation of multiple case studies. So for example, I think the best example will be through the example that we have. So there is an individual, a surgical patient that we had previously, a 30-year-old female, who would come with this prolonged lymphedema of the right side of the limb. And we actually tried conservative management for this patient for years, but they were all unsuccessful. So by the time the patient was coming back, a decision to try a surgical management was actually made. So for this patient, the figure number 1 just represents the size of the foot that the patient had at admission. And what made this case interesting is not really the fact that lymphedema is such a rare case. Of course, we know that it's very common, is how we actually managed it. Now, just a brief background. Most previous managements of lymphedema, if they're not conservative, most surgical methods have actually been suggested to be debridement. And as you can see in figure 2, that's actually what we did. The most common surgical method is debridement. Of course, we had other methods. For example, you can do your liposuction. But in this case, what has been shown to occur is that surgical methods alone have been shown to have not as good outcomes. I won't say worse outcomes. I'll say not as good outcomes as methods which have been combined, whereby in our case, we actually did a surgical technique and you need a lymph node excision. And I'll be able to describe the importance of each of them. So as you can see in our case, the most common complications you might have after doing a surgical debridement solely, you might have scarring or hyperkeratosis. You can have sensorineural injuries, okay? But in our case, what had been suggested from literature had been a combination of both surgical debridement and lymph node excision will actually have better outcomes. So in our case, figure 2 represents the debridement that was done. This patient was later returned to the ward for about 5 weeks, whereby the lymph node dissection from the submandibular region was actually done and replaced around the inguinal region of the affected limb. Now, the importance of this is that first, the lymph node excision acts as one to be able to produce the vascular endothelial growth factor, which has been shown to be important in regrowth of these lymph nodes, thereby improving the vascular circulation of the affected limb. So in this case, we combined the two procedures and the outcome was actually good. This patient had only one complication, and that was pain. We didn't have any of the other complications that I've been able to mention, the scarring, the sensorineural injury. So this is just a case whereby, for example, you can see we employed 2 methods in a usual case where we would have employed only maybe a surgical debridement. So the actual aspect of it being a case report is that in this case, we are suggesting as a new thing, as a rare thing, that maybe the combination of both two, the surgical debridement and the lymph node excision, will be a better procedure to do with better outcomes as compared to either the common one, which is the surgical debridement. So the aspect of it being a case report is that we employed 2 new methods which have not been employed normally in management of the same case. Now, the next case I have is an interesting one. This is more of an anatomical one. As I've already mentioned, is that we actually found this case as we were conducting the earlier study, which I've already shown you guys on the dimensions of the calcaneus. So in this case, we actually had one calcaneus, which had shown to have an elongated sentaculum thalli. Now, just like I've already mentioned, a case report is you trying to bring out a rare case. So an elongated sentaculum thalli has actually been shown to be very rare. And most of its medical implications have actually been joint instability. So we wanted to bring out this case, first because it's rare, 2 because of its clinical implication, and 3rd because rarely enough will you find an elongated sentaculum thalli, even in patients who have the joint instability. So again, just to reiterate, not focus so much on the case, but to be able to mention that we are just highlighting a rare thing. So a case report is you coming out and telling us, hey guys, this is rare, this is important clinically and scientifically, maybe we should pay focus on it. You get? A case series, on the other hand, is multiple case reports of the same case that you're trying to bring out. Unfortunately, I don't have an example of a case series to be able to document, to be able to show you guys, but I think you can find multiple on Google Scholar. So finally, on the surveys. Now, a survey is a type of study whereby, in most cases, you want to collect data that is mostly related to perceptions of individuals. So an example of a survey in this case will be you want to maybe collect data on how people are responding maybe to a particular intervention that has been done. So we can say maybe, for example, in a university, you come up with a place where guys can use their computers or they can charge their computers. Then you go in subsequently and assess how happy have these guys got after the introduction of such an intervention. So most of the time, surveys usually depend on verbal to verbal reports, whereby most times you'll find yourself collecting data from your sample individually, unlike other types of study designs. Most of the time they actually use questionnaires, but in few cases you can actually use the telephone. As I've mentioned, the types of surveys can be either descriptives, exploratory, correlational, or comparative, based on what you're really trying to get or to assess from your population. This is a type of a survey whereby, unlike other studies that have participated, we actually got this one from the internet because we didn't have any particular that have been participated in. So in this case, they were assessing the medical, self-perceptive preparedness to care for gender diverse patients. So just to highlight here is that in this particular study, unlike other study designs, they're looking at perceptions, more of perceptions as compared to other types of objectives or outcomes that we'll be comparing. So I think maybe you can look at more surveys on Google Scholar. I will be available to suggest a few for those who will be interested. So generally, descriptive studies have advantages and disadvantages. Unlike other types of studies which are going to be discussed by my colleague, most descriptive studies are very easy to conduct because most of them are less time consuming and less demanding in terms of finances. But most of them will have multiple disadvantages. The first is that which we've already highlighted when you're looking at the pyramid, that because they are low in terms of the hierarchy on the pyramid, but also mostly because they're not as replicative as maybe, for example, RCTs, then most of the results that we derive from them are not, for example, comparative to an RCT that will be done for the same or assessing the same type of outcome within the same population. So they're low in the hierarchy of scientific evidence. They don't test hypotheses. There's also a possibility of low response rate with surveys, whereby you actually have less people as compared to the ones you've calculated in the sample population to actually get data from. But you'll actually find that as a medical student, like when I was a medical student, it's very easy to conduct these descriptive studies. So I'll suggest that the first place maybe you can start off is, for example, a case report case series as you grow towards your descriptive and other type of studies. So those are some of my sample references where I got most of my information from. Feel free to look at them, and thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Thomas, for your wonderful presentation on descriptive observational studies. Particularly, I quite liked the part where you highlighted the advantages and disadvantages. So, before we move on, could you please discuss in a bit detail the ethical implications that can arise while conducting a case report or say a case series? What are the problems that the students can face when they're undertaking such a project?
So thank you very much for that question. From personal experience, I will say that if you're mostly dealing with case reports involving clinical data or data from patients, the first thing to appreciate is that you will need to have permission from patients before you use their data. From experience, actually. And even it's actually possible that in some cases, for example, in the surgical debridement that we did, you actually need an approval from an ethical board to say that what you're actually doing is ethically just, one, and two, you need permission from the patients before you are able to share their data. So I think those are the two ethical issues that I will share with my colleagues to be able to watch out for. Otherwise, they can land people in trouble.
Yeah, I totally agree with you, and thank you for your insight into the matter. Now we'll move on to the next part of the webinar, which is analytical observational studies presented by Dr. Francisco, who is currently a postdoctoral researcher at Harvard Public Health School. Over to you, Dr. Francisco.
Thank you so much, Romeo. And it's a pleasure to be here with you discussing the analytical observational studies, specifically the methodological implications of cohort studies, case control studies, and cross-sectional studies. Okay, so I think for the analytical aspect of research, we need to first understand what we want to do with them, and having in mind that we want to establish causal relationships between an exposure and an outcome, or an intervention and an outcome. Since this is our intention, there are some things that we need to consider, right? So the kind of questions that we can answer using causal inference, or we intend to answer causal inference, is specifically what is the effect and the causal effect specifically of an exposure over an outcome in a very detailed patient population. And the reason that I bring this up is that this is the kind of questions that randomized clinical trials tend to answer. And the randomized clinical trials are the best study to answer causal questions because of one reason that I will explain in the following slides. So let's suppose we are analyzing the effect of an exposure over an outcome, A over Y. Let's say that A is aspirin. I'm sorry, there a switch. Let's say that A is aspirin and Y is dead. Now, let's say that we have another variable, right, such as cancer, that can be related to aspirin intake and to the death of the patient. So if a patient develops cancer, physicians can prescribe aspirin, right, to prevent thrombotic events. And if a patient develops cancer, they are more prone to die. So this is the variable that we commonly know know as a confounding variable. So cancer is confounding the relationship between aspirin or between the effect of aspirin on death. But cancer is not the same, is not the only variable to consider, right? We have age, which can be associated both with the exposure and the outcome. We have prior myocardial infarction, and we have other unknown and even unmeasured confounders, right? Even things that we do not think about them in the study design phase, that we don't collect information on, and they still can be confounding the relationship that we are trying to establish. So randomization, what it basically does is randomly allocates individuals to an intervention, right? That is the beauty of randomized clinical trials, that you can use chance to allocate individuals to receive the intervention or do not receive the intervention. And what randomization does is basically eliminates the association between the confounding variables and the treatment assignment, right? So in this case, it reduces the association between L, a confounder, or many confounders, with A, the exposure or the intervention. And therefore, we can study if we are able to maintain this balance that the randomization provides at baseline, then we are able to adjudicate the differences in the outcomes to the actual intervention without worrying about confounding effects or confounded effects. So in randomized clinical trials, an investigator assigns the treatment. Usually, well, in randomized, it is randomly assigned. However, it is not always feasible to conduct a randomized clinical trial. Sometimes an intervention is not ethical. Sometimes we don't have money. Sometimes we don't have human resources, infrastructure to conduct a randomized clinical trial. Um, and then other things that the randomized clinical trial have or can have is blinding, for example, and this kind of other methodological qualities of randomized clinical trial maintain that balance created by the randomization at baseline, so you're able to maintain that that balance until the end of the follow-up and establish the causal relationship. The usual structure of a randomized clinical trial is you select the eligible participants, you randomize to one group or another, you follow up, and then you measure the outcome. Now, when you are having causal questions in mind, and you only have randomized, I mean, observational studies that you can do, then what you basically need to do is try to make the observational study as close as possible as the randomized clinical trial would be. So there are many challenges by doing this, and this is where the understanding of the methods is important to be able to be aware of all the threats to the internal validity that the observational studies have. Um, the if you conduct a well done observational study, you can suggest strong relationships, right? You can suggest causal relationships, um, such as a randomized clinical trial. But this is not always the case. Sometimes we have many deficiencies in observational studies. So, trying to understand this, I will go through them, highlighting some methodological aspects of them. And this is just going to be an overview because of the time, but I hope this is comprehensive enough to get a good idea of the methods. So non-experimental studies, um, the main difference is that the investigator does not assign the intervention or the exposure, right? Cohort studies have a similar structure to the randomized clinical trials. The main difference is that the investigator does not assign the exposure, and therefore it cannot be randomized. Now, case control studies are similar to a cohort study, but we are more efficient sampling method. And I'm going to go into the details of this in a bit. Then we have cross-sectional studies that, as my colleague Tom said, is just a snapshot in time. And then ecological studies that study associations at the population level and not at the individual level. So let's start with the cohort studies. So what is a cohort? The word comes from the Roman cohorts, and it was a tactical unit, a military tactical unit in the Roman legion, right? So it's a group of people that belong to the same cohort in this case, and um, they have defined characteristics, and they cannot um, move to another cohort. I mean, they form a group of individuals, right? So this is where a cohort comes from, and we have different types of cohorts studies, right? Um, a closed cohort would have a defined starting point to a defined ending point, and what defines the membership of an individual belonging to a closed cohort study is a specific event that will not change over time. Some examples: the attendance of this webinar are a closed cohort. If we define the membership, the status of a cohort of the attendance of this webinar, this would be a closed cohort, right? Because it's an event and it will not change. You will always be attendant of this webinar, no matter when we look at it. People born in 2022 would also be a closed cohort, right? It's you either belong there or you don't. Closed cohorts does not accept new members. This is important compared to open cohorts, right? In closed cohorts, we have time zero, in which the members of the cohort are counted. And then we have a specific follow-up time, right? We have time zero plus delta time, which is the difference of follow-up time. And between time zero and delta time, we can see what happened in the cohort. So the events observed can be measured in a closed cohort, right? And under certain assumptions, the cumulative incidence can be estimated and will be valid. Um, the cumulative incidence, we're going to review what that is in a bit, but it's just measuring the accumulation of events. Now, a fixed cohort is similar to a closed cohort, but when there is dropout of a study, right? So an individual can drop out of the study. And a randomized clinical trial, for example, is a good example of a fixed cohort. You belong to the story, to the study, and you can drop out of the study eventually, right? This loss to follow up is often called censoring individuals, and the observation of that individual stops when, or of a certain individual can stop when an event happens. You also have competing risks. So, for example, if you are measuring that due to cancer in a cohort and the individual dies in a car accident, that is a competing risk, right? Because it makes it impossible to measure death due to cancer because the person died because of a car accident. So this is another implication of a fixed cohort. The exposure, this is true for all kinds of cohorts. The exposure may vary over time. So if an individual, you are classifying it as exposed to drinking coffee, for example, in a certain moment, the individual can stop drinking coffee, and you have to be aware of that varying nature of the exposures. Due to these concerns, right, loss to follow up, competing risks, and the varying exposure, the incidence rate is a solution, right? Because if you try to use cumulative incidence when you have these implications, the estimate will be biased. So incidence rate is the solution in this case. And for incidence rate, we use person time. We measure person time. So what is person time is the time accumulated under observation and at risk of developing the outcome by every individual in a cohort. So for example, here we have 5 individuals. They were followed for different amount of times. The reason for the end of follow-up are different, right? Some of them, 3 and 4, were lost to follow-up. They moved out of the city, or they stopped coming to the visits, or something else, right? 2 and 5 stop being measured or observed because they developed the event of interest, and individual number one um, stopped being observed because the study ended, right, 5 years after. So each of these individuals contributes a different amount of person time at risk. And if we add all these years contributed by each individual at risk, then we have a total of 14 person years in this mini cohort of 5 individuals. So if we try to estimate the incidence rate with this, then we would have two incident cases, right? Two new events between time zero and time delta over 14 person years. That would be one case per 7 person years. And you can just standardize it to 1,000 person years, and you would have 142.9 cases per 1,000 person years. So the incidence rate is a measure that allows you to account for different time of follow-up, for censoring of individuals, and for competing risks and time varying exposures, right? So this is a very common measure used in cohort studies. Now, an open cohort, in different contrasting with a closed cohort, is a cohort in which individuals are allowed to come in and out of the study. The definition of a member is now a state, um, a status. I mean, a status. You have a membership defining status or state in which, for example, residents of New York from 2000 to 2010 would be an open cohort because individuals can come in and out of the cohort. Mountain bikers in the Blue Hills Reservation Park from 2005 to 2006 would be an open cohort. Different people can go and use their bicycle in the mountain during that year, but you are analyzing specifically at the people that go to the mountain. It doesn't matter who are they, right? Subjects can also change exposure, such as in closed cohorts. And in open cohorts, because of this variability in the subjects, you can only estimate rates, incidence rates, and not a cumulative incidence, right, as in closed cohorts. So the usual structure when you have two or more exposure groups in a cohort study is you select the eligible population and you classify them as exposed or non-exposed, right? You don't have randomization. But then everything else is kind of similar to an RCT. You follow up studies and then you measure you follow up participants and then you measure the outcome. Let's see an example. This is a prospective cohort study of cannabis use and how this predisposed to psychosis or psychotic symptoms. So the investigators wanted to study the relationship between cannabis use and psychotic symptoms in individuals with above average predisposition for psychosis. This is an analysis of prospective data from a population-based sample, and the main outcome is psychotic symptoms at follow-up. The exposure is cannabis use. So if we draw the diagram, A would be cannabis use, Y would be a psychosis episode. Again, the legends are flipped. I'm sorry for that. So A is exposure, cannabis use. The outcome is Y, psychosis episode. And here as well, we have confounders, right? Age would be a confounder because it is associated with psychosis, with cannabis use and psychosis episode. Socioeconomical status can also be a confounder. Urbanicity, childhood trauma, use of tobacco, use of alcohol, and many other variables can be confounders of the relationship between cannabis use and psychosis episode. The downside is that we don't have randomization in observational studies to eliminate this confounding, right? So what we have to do is use statistical adjustment techniques to adjust for this or to account for this confounding. So that is a big difference between randomized clinical trials and observational studies. So you would see typical results like this in observational studies, in which you have, in this case, we have odds ratios, which is a measure of association between an exposure and an outcome. And you would always see the unadjusted odds ratio and then adjustment for different covariates and different estimates that come out of different models with increasing number of variables being adjusted for. So in the unadjusted, we have an odds ratio of 1.8 with a confidence interval that is between the parentheses, and the additional adjustment with the last one, we have 1.53. So we can see that after adjusting for confounders, the investigators get a more or a less dramatic odds ratio, right? It is closer to the null, but it is still significant as the point estimate 1.53, and both of the limits of the confidence interval are above 1. So this would be in favor of supporting that cannabis use is associated with an increased odds of a psychotic event. So we can adjust for what we measure. We can only adjust for what we measure. So if we don't measure important covariates that can be confounders, if we don't measure them, we don't have information for them, we cannot include those in the model. So that is not the case in randomized clinical trials, because even what you don't measure, the randomization takes care of it to a certain extent and under certain assumptions. Also, we often don't know about confounders. Sometimes we don't know that something can confound the relationship. And if we don't know about that something, we don't measure it, and it's the same case, we cannot adjust for it. Randomization also takes care of this, right, under certain assumptions. So that is the beauty of randomized clinical trials, and this is the most important thing to consider in observational studies that are trying to establish causal relationships. So let's move on to a case control study. A case control study can be think about as an efficient sampling method of an underlying cohort. So the idea of a case control study is the same as the cohort. It is establish a causal relationship if that is your intention, right? You want to establish a causal relationship, but instead of measuring all the individuals in a cohort, you are sampling individuals to make it more efficient. So you decrease the resources needed, economical or infrastructure or time, and you increase the productivity of this study. We have three concepts that are critical to understanding case control study. The first one is base population. Base population is the entire group of individuals that are considered in the cohort that you are studying, right? So all the individuals that can be cases and can be controls are the base population, right? The base population, these individuals under observation, and everyone should be at risk of developing the outcome or of becoming a case in this setting, contribute different amounts of person time, right? So going back to the cohort, to a person time explanation, we can have many individuals at risk of developing the outcome, and every individual contributes different amount of person time. So this person time contributed by the base population is called the study base. And the study base is basically the entire amount of person time that you are using to study the relationship that you are studying, right? So cases are those individuals of the base population that develop the outcome of interest. And controls are those individuals at risk of developing the outcome, at risk of developing of becoming a case, that do not become a case or do not develop the outcome. So if you think about this as efficient sampling of a cohort study, the cases would represent the rates that you would have calculated in a cohort analysis, and the controls would represent the relative size of person time of the denominators that you would have observed in a cohort analysis. And because you are sampling, and this sampling technique has to be with certain characteristics, and it should represent the entire distribution of the exposure in the cohort. But you are not analyzing the entire cohort. You are just sampling some individuals from there. So we have different sampling schemes in case control studies. We have incidence density sampling, which is one of the most common ones. In incidence density sampling, you sample person time, as we just discussed. We have risk set sampling, which is a subtype of incidence density sampling. We have case cohort sampling. We also sample person time in this case cohort scheme. We have case crossover, and in which we also use person time sampling. And finally, we have cumulative incidence sampling, in which we do not sample person time, but instead we sample individuals. So these are different schemes that have different methodological implications. We will go only to the first two because of time, but they should be considered for different type of questions and different type of data that you have available, and different type of questions that you want to answer. Some of these studies would be a better fit for some questions and some types of data than others. So this is a diagram of a full cohort study, right? We can have a certain number of individuals, and all the individuals are followed up to a certain amount of time. Some of them develop the outcome, which is in red. Some of them do not develop the outcome, right? So in the full cohort, we have exposed cases, unexposed cases, right? We have E, which is exposure, and E with a line on top, which is not exposure. We have those that were exposed, those that were not exposed. We have cases for those two. And each of these categories contribute different amount of person time, right? So person time is the denominator for the incidence rates, as we reviewed earlier, and the cases are the new events that develop between time 0 and time 1. This is in the case of a full cohort. Now, an incidence density sampling case control study would randomly select person time from the entire cohort. So instead of measuring all the individuals, you would just use points in time of individuals that did not develop the outcome to serve as control. And if you sample randomly, then this person time, this pieces of person time would represent the entire follow-up time of a cohort study. Now, instead, if you see the 2x2 table, instead of having the person time in the second row, now we have controls, right? We have controls. And these controls are these participants that did not develop the outcome of interest, but were at risk of developing the outcome. Risk set sampling is similar to incidence density sampling, but you only sample when an event occurs. So in this case, the first event occurs at a specific point in time, and you sample individuals at that moment, and you analyze the exposure status for the cases and controls in that moment. And then in the second moment, third moment, and so on and so forth. So this is an example. We have substance use disorders and risk of suicide in the general US population, a case control study, and the investigators said we conducted a case control study using electronic health records. They had 2,674 men and women who died by suicide between the time frame and over 260,000 matched controls. The main outcome was suicide mortality, and the exposure was substance use in different categories. So we have the cases, right? And then we have the controls, and they say that each case was matched by time period and site to a randomly selected sample of 100 members who were also enrolled in the same health system, and they have the same availability and quality of data than the cases. That they fulfilled certain eligibility criteria, and this random sample of 100 members that were matched by time period served as the controls for the cases. So each case had 100 controls, and they were randomly selected. So they represent the entire population from where the cases occurred, right? So this is an example of a risk set sampling, because we have the moment in which the suicide happened, the suicide event happened, and then we sample individuals at that point in time, 100 controls. And we analyze the exposure status from those that died and those that did not die. We can see that if we compare the characteristics of the individual's controls and cases and controls, we have substantial differences. So these are confounders, right? So we need to adjust for these differences. And we can see in table 2, we have the results. We have unadjusted odds ratios, and then we have adjusted odds ratios, such as in the Cohort study. As you can see, the adjusted odds ratio for alcohol only is 15, which is a very high odds ratio. When you adjust for certain characteristics, certain variables that could be confounders, the odds ratio decreases to 5.8, which is very less dramatic, right? So as you can see, case control studies are similar to cohort studies, but they use a more efficient sampling. They do not analyze the entire cohort. They do not analyze the entire study population. They analyze a sample of this study population. They often analyze all the cases that arise from the study population, but they sample controls in different ways, right? In this case, this was a risk set sampling scheme. The odds ratios are the only valid measure of association that can be estimated in case control studies. This is the only one that is a valid measure of association in case control studies. And depending on the sampling scheme, the odds ratio will approximate different measures. So in the risk set sampling, the odds ratio approximates the incidence rate ratio that you would have observed in the entire cohort study. It doesn't mean that the investigators can estimate the incidence rate ratio. It just means that the odds ratio, if the case control study is conducted properly, will approximate the incidence rate ratio. The incidence rate ratio is a ratio of the incidence rate in the exposed over the incidence rate in the unexposed. So it's a relative measure of association that measures the relative increase or decrease rate of an event happening when you compare case exposed and unexposed people. The case cohort study and the case crossover study, if they're conducted correctly, and if they sample correctly as well. The odds ratio in those sampling schemes will also approximate incidence rate ratio. The only one that estimates or approximates to a different one is the cumulative incidence sampling, which estimates the cumulative incidence ratio. Finally, there is this terminology about studies being retrospective or prospective, and there are many different versions for the definition of this. The one that I use is prospective studies are those studies in which the exposure information was collected for research purposes before the outcome happened. Those studies that were collecting for research purposes the exposure information before the outcome happened are prospective studies. Retrospective studies are those studies in which the exposure information was collected for research purposes after the outcome happened. And both case controls and cohorts can be retrospective or prospective, right? It depends on what is the underlying cohort and how that information was collected. So that will dictate if a case control is prospective or retrospective, right? But both case control and cohorts can be retrospective or prospective. And finally, we have the cross-sectional study, which for analytical purposes doesn't offer a lot. It is not ideal for etiologic research. It is not ideal to estimate a causal effect because it includes all the sample at the time of data collection, and the exposure and the outcome are measured at the same time. And they're mostly used to measure prevalence. So this is what I had prepared. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Francisco, for your wonderfully comprehensive presentation. I particularly like the comparison between retrospective and prospective studies that you presented at the end. I have one question for you. You know that the journals are particularly interested in the studies that are following reporting guidelines. So, what do you think is the importance of proper reporting in observational studies, and what, in your opinion, could be the implications of poorly reported observational studies?
Yes, that's a very important question. And the reporting guidelines are guidelines that are developed to increase the transparency of the methodological aspects of the study. So all these implications that we discussed are important because of the conclusions that you can make, right? These are all threats that observational studies have. And if you do not document what you did in a study, then the readers and other investigators would not be able to replicate your findings. So I think that is the most important implication, and that is why it is important first to be aware of the methodological implications when you start designing your study, and two, report what you did in the most optimal way.
Thank you for your wonderful insight into the matter. Now we have uh, Vincent with us, who is going to discuss a little about the IGMS World Conference for Medical Student Research. And these guys have been doing a wonderful job. This conference is going to be held in October, and Vincent is going to discuss this in a bit more detail.
Hello, everyone, and thank you so much, Tom and Francisco, for having a wonderful presentation today. It's been quite informative. And mine here is just to briefly outline a few things as regards to the upcoming conference. And just to start us off is that we, as the IGMS, we have an upcoming conference that's scheduled for the 12th of November, 2022. And in terms of how you can partner with us in participation of the conference, whether as a presenter or as an audience, I'll share a few details with us here today. So in our website, we have the conference page, and through it, you can access the conference link and have it shared with your colleagues, your friends. And when you click on the conference page, it will take you to the snapshot that is available on the bottom right of your screen, where you can be able to subscribe for notifications, like, and then share it out with your circles. So in terms of who can participate in the upcoming conference, medical students of all categories as outlined are invited to participate, but also recently graduated physicians up to 3 years of practice. With regards to the rules and regulations, within the conference page, we have all the details available regarding the conference in terms of who can participate in details, in terms of the information for potential authors and the author requirements, how the abstract should be structured, the different areas within which we are focusing on, the submission process, and the steps to be completed by the corresponding author, as well as how to go about the submission fee, the selection process, and also the program for the upcoming conference. Now, to submit your abstract with us, you could go to the website on www.ijms.info, click on the conference tab, and get to review the rules and regulations first regarding the abstract submission. Now, if you click on the link, it will take you or redirect you to a page with, as outlined in this snapshot. And under the conference tab, select abstract submission. And it will take you to the rules and regulations that I've just briefly mentioned. And after having understood all the rules and regulations for the conference as regards to how to go about the abstract submission, you can then move forward to click on the Make a Submission tab. And after clicking on this tab, you'll have several set of instructions to guide you appropriately on how to make the final submission. As I mentioned earlier, we have a submission fee, and the proceeds for this fee go on towards continually empowering the supporting medical student research in terms of improving their visibility, enabling us to continue supporting medical students all the way from early career, mid career, and late career scientists. And the charges that we have as at now is $10 for each of the submission. And we have a PayPal link that will enable you to make this submission fee. The selection process has broadly been divided into two. We have the initial screening, just to ensure that each of the abstracts that have been submitted do have followed the rules and regulations set forth by the conference committee. And thereafter, for those abstracts that meet the screening criteria, they will then undergo a series of judging based on a few guidelines that have been set. And for more details, you could access the scoring criteria through the conference page on our website. Now, in the end, we'll have certificates of participation for the presenters, and also an additional mention for those who will be selected as the winners based on the judging criteria. And we have an entire team which is completely dedicated towards having the upcoming conference well in, and this is the team that is behind this. And we are hoping that each of us will give into this, make the submissions, and partner with us in having the International Journal of Medical Students World Conference of Medical Student Research. And in case of any clarifications, we have our email that you can reach out to us and send in any queries, and we'll be happy to respond. Thank you.
Thank you, Vincent, and I'm sure you'll be receiving a lot of abstracts after this webinar. And we'll be looking forward to everyone participating in our World Conference, and we'll be looking forward to your abstracts as well. So once again, I thank the speakers and I thank the audience particularly for joining us today. And we'll be looking forward to your participation for the next webinar, which will be conducted in October, and it will be on the experimental study designs. So looking forward to your participation, and thank you once again.